Okay. So I hope you managed class okay on Tuesday. I was taking students down to the Twin Cities all day, so I was gone on Tuesday. Um, so we had two guest speakers. How was Federated? Did they sound interesting? Okay. Did they talk about agile stuff in class? They promised they would, but sometimes they say that and they come and they sell themselves. What's that? Oh, good. So did it sound pretty similar to other agile stuff we've seen? Okay, that's good. We like that. So and then who'd we have? Who was the guest speaker? Yeah, the computer chem double major from 2011. How is he? He's out in Seattle, right? Do you remember that? What?
Yeah,
Yeah. Mac, was it? James Matico. That's what it was. James. So yes. Yeah, so he's out in Seattle. It's been we talk to him about every 2 years in this class, and then it's always interesting. He's been to a number of different big and small companies and stuff like that. So it's always interesting to see. So um all right, so let's get started today. Um so again, we're still doing the unit of the textbook where we break our code up into parts. We started with one long method and we broke it up into smaller methods last week. And this week we're taking those smaller methods and putting them in a lot of different classes. Because again, it's single responsibility principle. Each class should just be doing one thing. And then we're putting interfaces between those classes uh, to try to break everything up and to make it easier, like when we do unit testing, to substitute one class for another for different things here. So that's what we're doing today, is looking at that stuff. Looking at, can I get that up? And again, we're doing this currency kind of trading app, which has some really simple data and setup for this. So again, this is our single responsibility principle. Again, we've taken this data that was in one long class, broken it up, and then now we're adding interfaces to it. So we have a trade processor, and we have these interfaces, an iTrade data provider. So we have to get the data from somewhere. We read it in from like a text file, and today we'll read it in from a file stored on in the web, and then we'll read it in from a JSON file also. Then we parse that data. So we have this iTrade parser, and then we store that data in a database. We have that iTrade storage stuff, and this saves it into the database. So those are our three main interfaces and our data here. So we're going to continue working with that. So go into the learning activity, uh, go into this project, accept the assignment, clone this assignment. And this is just a different version of this assignment that has a bunch of unit tests and a little bit more in it to start with. And it's also missing some components, which you are adding today. So we're cloning this repository. Yes, right. You should clone it, not just download it. When you get it here, I think it should, so I've already edited this. Let me get it back to the state where you have it, I think. So in your version, we're reading from a file here, and it should run okay. I think if you just hit run, it should open up the provider will open up the file, will read the traits in the file, will then connect to Azure Cloud Database, and we should be able to write to that database. It may time out again. Sometimes this with the Azure database isn't up and primed. It times out the first time. So we'll see. It looks like it might time out this time. Because it's not, it usually happens. If it happens, it's going to happen pretty fast there. So yeah, it timed out here. So I'm just going to wait a sec and run this again. So I'm just going to talk about this for a sec while we're waiting for it to start up here. So in the main program, I'm just going to show you that a little bit. We create a number of objects and then kind of pass them back and forth here. So we create a logger for logging our errors and our information and stuff like that. We create a stream to our data file locally. So here's our trade.txt file, and then we open up a stream for that. We also have a couple URLs we're going to set up. One, and these are new for 2024. One is our trade data out there as a text file, just raw text file. It's actually just stored in GitHub here. So we just can access this trade data directly. I don't know why that's there. Okay, so then here's our trade data out there. It's just a text file, basically. The other one is an Azure data or RESTful API server, which I've created out there that just serves up the same data, but strings, but just in a real simple JSON format here, a list of strings out there. So now then we declare our different objects. And now this is getting this, so we'll see this a lot going forward. It's all sometimes related to dependency injection, where we create all the objects in the main program and then just kind of pass them back and forth whoever needs an object. So like the trade validator needs a logger. So up here, we've created a logger object and we pass that to the trade validator. So it knows what to use for logging there. We create, and right now we're creating a number of different providers, a file provider, a URL provider, and a RESTful provider. And again, we can pass those to our trade processor. So again, remember our trade processor here, it needs a data provider, something to read in the data. It needs something to parse the data. It needs something to store the data to a database. So we provided a provider, a parser, and a storage option that's used to store the data in a persistent stuff. So we declare those objects ahead and then create those. And some of them, like our parser, actually needs a mapper and a validator here. So when we're creating our parser, we have to actually pass it the trade mapper and the trade validator for setting that up. So finally, we get our trade processor all set, and we just have it process trades. So if you're changing things like here, eventually we'll switch to a URL here. We have a URL trade provider, but again, when we create our trade processor, we'll want it to pass it our URL provider rather than our file provider at some point. Okay, so let's see. Now, again, I said this should work. Let's see if it does work now that it's set up and run. Yeah, so now it's set up. So we read the trades from the file stream. We connected to the cloud database and we processed 4 trades. So that worked fine now. Now when we run our tests here, if I go to test, run all tests, or if I just my Test Explorer is open somewhere, which you should have it today, I can run those tests. Now, I've done the assignment, most of it. I've done the learning activity. So everything but the validation test should pass. But when you're working this, your URL test will fail because that code isn't there. And your RESTful data will also fail because that code isn't there. So your job is to update those codes here. Now you can just get it to run these tests. You can also set up here. So let's go back to the assignment or learning activity. So again, we're going to have different, we're going to track, again, the people out in the workforce often call these tickets, I call them requests. So we have a ticket 407. Trader wants to be able to read data from companies' new web service. So you can enter codes from different apps. So you want to get the URL trade data provider test to pass. So again, when you run yours, this URL trade data test probably fails here. So we want to get that to pass. Solution, you have to modify that. So if we go into that test, that is calling trade data, get trade data, is trying to read data from a URL here. So we're creating a trade provider here, a URL trade provider, and doing that. So we want, that's not working for some reason. So you need to make sure that you must modify URL trade data provider class to make sure it works with it. And so if you go into your URL trade data provider, it probably doesn't have any code in it yet. Well, it has some code in it, but most of the code just says fail on it. So your job is to update that. Okay, so I'm going to let you loose. So again, you should be going into simple responsibility principles, URL trade data provider here, and modifying that so it works. Here's some initial code. Oh, hey, is that the right code? Oops. Some initial kind of code for what it should kind of look like. So you can even copy that initial code and paste that in there and see. And there, but there's a lot of comments in here like log the error and throw an exception. Well, it doesn't do that, so you have to do that. So see if you can get that up and running. When it's working and you run your tests, this URL trade data provider test should turn green. There. So I'll let you work on that. Again, feel free to use AI, ask your neighbor, ask me. It's just a learning activity. And the solution actually is posted down below. So if you get really stuck, you can actually look at the solution. But I'd rather you not look at the solution right away. I'd like you to learn, try to work it out. Okay, let's pause this. Okay, just a quick note for those of you using Visual Studio, like in lab, that I've seen both two students now do, is if you work on it, go away and come back another day to open it up. So you're not just cloning it, it's already on your file. Don't go to open folder, go to open project or solution. They're different there, and we always want to open up the solution. So go to project and then solution, find your project, and then click on the SLN file. Also, if you're just opening up from a folder, double click on the SLN folder or file rather than anything else, and that'll open it up. Because if you open up a folder, it doesn't do the solution properly, and then things like the test environment and stuff like that don't work. So if you have problems where everything was working that's not, try that and see if that will help. So one thing to note is, again, I had some code out there earlier and it turned out to be out of date for a couple reasons. So I made a couple updates, but if you have the older code, you can update it. One thing to watch is the URL, the trade URL is strange. It used to be a givens file, and that whole web server the college took down. So this is the new trade URL here. Is this one here. So that shows up in two spots. One is in your tests. So in your tests, if your test is still failing, you're in the test one, it says trade URL, and it lists the old Gibbons family web or some other website out there. It's not active anymore. And so you should, we want this file to be out there. So update the URL to that. You can just basically, you should be able to just copy that line and update that. Oops, I clicked somewhere. That also shows up in the program in single responsibility principles, the program CIS file. There's the trade URL there also, and that should be this new one. So you should update that here. You might get an error in your trade URL data provider. We were in the old version, there was a web client interface, and now it's been large. That still works, but it is deprecated. And so HTTP client is the preferred way. But again, your test should still run even with that original code, assuming you're using the new URL for that. So again, in your test, make sure that this trade URL is updated to the one shown in the assignment. So as far as debugging goes, sometimes debugging these tests are hard. So I have an error now in my URL trade data provider. My test one, size one fails. So a couple of things you can do to help with debugging is click on the tests, and then down here, it should tell you more about that test. Should tell you what lines, if it's like mine is getting an exception, it should tell you where it is there. So it should tell you it threw an exception or something like that here. Error trying to retrieve data from there. And it should tell you again what line it is. So it should be looking in URL trade var, get trade data. And yeah, it's getting it. It's actually, this is throwing the exception there. So somehow my response is not working correctly there. So that's one thing you can do. Another thing is you can do is not just look at the test, but actually run the data itself, run the file itself here. To run this, you need to change our code. Make sure the program.cs is using the URL trade data provider. You can modify the program.cs file to use that trade data provider. So if I go into program.cs, it should set up a URL trade data provider. But there's this line here, when we set up the trade processor, it calls it with the file, it reads it from the local file. We want to switch these two around so that it will use the URL trade provider here. Then I can, rather than just running a test, sometimes it's more helpful to run the actual code, and I should get the same exception. And again, now it jumps me right to there and tells me the error and stuff like that. Okay, so see if that works and if you can figure out what the error was, and hopefully then you can figure out how to fix the error and then run it, and then it will, hopefully you can get to run correctly in the code, and then when you run your tests, you can get to pass. So those are some hints for debugging. So I find AI does help here. This is an area where I think AI can do fairly well. I use Copilot here. I gave it the initial code that was there with the throw exception. I gave it the instructions from the assignment and had it then implement those. And again, I see this is pretty typical. Like if you're a new programmer out there, you'll be given a task like, for a sprint. Okay, here you're given this ticket, and some advanced lead software designer may give you an outline of kind of what you want to do here. That's what I'm trying to giving here is this kind of outline of what it should do, and you have to fill it all in. And again, you can use AI. So I gave it the outline, and it gives me a pretty reasonable solution to that. I haven't tested it, but it looks pretty correct. So feel free to try AI on some of that. In the second part, test-driven design, I actually tell you, don't give you starting code, but just tell you that and suggest you try AI for that, see how that works. I don't know if you saw the newest earnings report from Google just reported that 25% of their code, a quarter of all their code currently in this last year was written by AI. So they're expecting their developers to use AI to write at least a quarter of their code now. So keep that in mind as as you're working with this and say, oh, should I be using AI in class or not? And my answer is, well, when you get your job, they're going to probably expect you to be using AI to do it. So not that it solves all the problems. One of my typical things is like, I go, AI tells you to maybe try something, and it's hard to recognize when it gives you the wrong answer too. So it'll lead you down the wrong paths at times too. One thing I do suggest with these is that I would prefer, and again, this is what companies are generally prefer, is there are a number of different requests. My thought is that you will do a commit, a final commit, at least one commit where you say request 409 is done there. And then for the assignment, there's 403, 405 there. So I will look at your commits and I'll see, request 403, in a perfect world, you would have a commit that say 403 finished or something like that. And I could then look at your code at that point and see that it's done. And again, a lot of times in a work environment, you'll have tickets. And again, you might have some, working tickets along the way, but you should have some final commit or some final thing that says, this is done. Now you don't have to at this point. I can also just look at your code and see. But that is generally the standard, is that when you're given a ticket, you reference that ticket number somewhere in your commit stuff. Okay, I know a number of you are finished with the learning activity. So and are asking about that. So when you're done with the learning activity, your RESTful trade data test should provide, and the URL trade data provider will pass. But the simple trade validator test will still fail. There'll still be a number of those fail because that's the assignment. So if you're at here, we have green, green, red, green, green, you're good for the learning activity. That means you've done part 1 and part 2 and committed those, hopefully. Then for the assignment, you want to go to part 3. And again, someone was asking, so that's these tests for different amounts. So amounts over like 100,000. And so again, those are running your simple trade validator here. So if I go to that here, this is the simple trade validator. You're giving some trade data and you're validating it. So in the instructions, I think it said validate trade data method. It is just now called validate. I haven't updated. So you should be updating this validate method so that now it checks for a number of things, but it should also check for the legal amounts and stuff like that. And then for the assignment, all these should be green when you get that working. So, all right. You should be allowing up to 1 million trades. So just a quick correction here. If you do the assignments, trades should be between 1,000 and 1 million. You're not 100,000. Is how it's set up. So I will update that to be that way. So you should be checking out the amount of things you can buy should be between 1,000 and 1 million for that. That's what the tests are set up to do. So So this should be a million. Because yeah, if you put in a million there, I mean, if you that should work. Because if you look at the tests, the tests are actually named on two says the test checked for 100K, but this is actually not 100K. This is a million. I can actually put in some dashes in here to show that. And so is this one. You should be able to get to the point where all your tests are green in the assignment.